Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the second in our series on remote teaching. Jack, could you start the recording, please? This session is called Communicating Your Ideas Online. And as you can see on the notice, could you please check that your audio is on, you can hear me, and that your mic and camera are off. It's quite disruptive to have lots of audio feeds and the camera, turn it off so that we can save on bandwidth so that this is less likely to crash. We have more than 100 people in the room, which means that anybody who is joining now won't have access to the chat. But if you want to ask questions, please use the email address that is on the screen just now, and we will be checking that periodically so that I can answer questions at the end. Okay, so let's get started. And we have recorded. We are recording. Okay, so does anybody recognize this man? One person does. Brilliant. Okay, if you can't see the image on the screen, there's a man in a suit and tie, possibly his pajama bottoms, speaking to the BBC, and there's a small child in a yellow jumper walking in at the back of the room. Okay, brilliant. So this is from 2017. Does anybody know his name? No. Funnily enough, very few people know his name, and I had to look it up. He is Robert Kelly, and he's a professor of political science. But really, well done, John and Deb. But really, doesn't matter what he achieves in his political science career now, he is never going to eclipse the fame that he got from having his two children walking in on the meeting. Sorry. Okay, so basically, I think if this had happened last week, there would have been almost no noise about it, because this is really, it's the situation that we're all living in now. So my children are here, they're downstairs, they've got the TV, they've got a movie, they don't know it yet, but they can have any snack they ask for. Their dad will block the door, and I have a chair against the door as well, but that is not going to stop my youngest coming in crying, or my oldest, who is more sensible, standing outside the door and shouting to me through it. So it's very much of our times, this situation, but it really underlines the delicacy of the live situation. So when we're trying to deliver lectures online, we have all of these things, not just whether the Wi-Fi is stable, whether your laptop battery will crash, but also whether you're going to be gate crashed by two humans that you made, or your pets, or whatever else. So it's nice to see that. Oh, music happening there. Thank you very much. Anyway, so it's a delicate time. As we can see, lots of things are going on. So today, what I want to concentrate on is the other part of this. So last week, we looked very much at how we manage the live session. So given that we've got to arrange a quiet space, which isn't always possible, to be able to do things together, what we do in that time to connect with each other and get content across. But we also want to look at how we get content across in a less kind of intense and resource intense way, asynchronously. So we're looking at things more along the lines of the Netflix model than the everybody watching the same soap opera at the same time model. So we're thinking about putting material out there that people can access whenever they want to, whenever it's convenient for them, and in a way that they manage to do easily and well. So our aims for today is we're going to look at some best practices for material creation and curation. We're going to look at choosing the modality, so how you choose to put your ideas across, what are your options, and why would you do it in one way and not in another way? We look at the difference between curating materials and creating materials, which I'm sure you're familiar with already, but just to take that discourse a little bit further. And then we'll explore how we take the materials, whether you've made them yourself, whether you've found them, and how you pack it with active learning so that we're not just handing over a really passive learning experience to our students. And then we're going to look at a very important notion called complementarity, which is really important when we start splitting out a live experience and a self-access set of materials. Okay, so because I don't like to criticize anybody else's work, here is some of mine. So we're going to start with the easy bits, and the easy bit today is creating DIY talking head video. So on the screen, you'll see 3 images of me. These are stills from videos that I created and made available to the appropriate audiences, and they are acceptable. So we're going to talk about framing, and they're acceptable, but they are not perfect. Okay, so if we just have a look at some of these images and tell me what is good about the framing, what works.
Your
Type your answers
eyes are
in the
about
chat.
a third of the way down.
Okay, yeah. If you can type your answers in the chat box, please. I'm getting a lot of messages from the chat outside the meeting room. 3 isn't boringly symmetric. Okay, great. Distracting elements, eye level. You can see me, brilliant. Okay, so if we take it from the left, my whole head is in shot, which is fantastic. Yeah, portrait orientation, Joanna, is that good or not so good? Makeup, maybe. Okay, so there's the comment about the background comment about my outfits. In the first one, it's portrait, which is not brilliant. My top is berserk, and I take up too much of the frame. You can see my face perfectly clearly. I'm very well lit, so if you need to lip read, it's absolutely fine. This was destined for Facebook, so the informal kind of outfit was appropriate at the time. But if I had to do it again, I wouldn't choose that top. In the second one, I did a bit better on wardrobe. It was a much more formal situation. It was for a conference presentation that I couldn't attend, but I chose to put the books in the background, which is interesting, but actually it's just a load of distraction. So all of that is happening while people might be noticing things about the books rather than listening to what I have to say. In the third one, I could have stacked a few more books underneath the phone that I was recording myself on, but the background is plain, my outfit is plain, there's nothing to distract from the main message. And if you'll notice in number 2 and number 3, there's a slight reflection on my glasses, which is not brilliant, but these are these are DIY times, so it's not terrible as long as lip readers can see clearly and there's no distraction for anybody who might have difficulty focusing. So these are our main examples. These are definitely not the best examples, but some of the best practices are to avoid distraction, remove them all. If you don't have a plain wall, take a picture down. Make sure your face is clearly visible, there's enough light, and you're not too close to the camera. I've seen a lot of people in meetings, and meetings are different from video that you create to keep there for a longer period of time. But there's a lot of people who kind of hulk over their laptops, and then there's a tendency for arms to come up, and maybe your head ends up resting in your hand, which makes you look really stressed. Possibly, maybe you are really stressed, but it makes you look more so, and that's a really negative kind of thing to communicate to your students. We don't need to hide that we're stressed or that this situation is stressful, because it definitely is, but we don't want to enhance that and risk transmitting that to our students as well. We don't want them to feel that. So nice keeping back in a position that you would normally take for lecturing, for transmitting this kind of information, and so that you feel normal and natural in the way that you would feel face to face, because staring down a camera is not the most comfortable thing for most people. The other thing about staring down the camera is you don't need to stare down the camera. So in a normal presentation, I would be maybe looking at my slides, I'd be thinking, I'd be looking at individuals within the audience. You still have all of that flexibility when you're online live and when you're creating your videos as well. So don't feel that you have to stare down the lens. So if you take as well the head and shoulders only idea, I gesticulate quite a lot, which can be very distracting for people. But equally, I wouldn't want to sit on my hands because it would make me look a bit wooden and difficult, and I wouldn't be very relatable. So if you can only see my head and shoulders, I can gesticulate. You can see some movement in my shoulders, but you're not seeing the madness that is what's going on with my hands at the bottom. And in number 3, I'm off to the side for a very specific reason. So to my right, to the left of the image, there's a big empty space there. So if you have some editing software, and in the pre-session materials, which you will have gotten a link to from your confirmation email, there is advice on how to create annotations in that space. So I can signal important information there, or I can explain things in a way that is useful. So that might not be something that's accessible to everybody just yet, but as we go and get ready for September and we become more comfortable with the technology and with the practices, then it's something that you might want to incorporate further down the line. So if when you're making your talking head videos now, you set them up as in number 3, so you frame them as 3, it gives you the possibility of adapting that later on. Okay, and the other point is don't wing it. Winging it is a bad idea. Being spontaneous is okay, but within a clear plan. So if you think of if you think of a dad dancing, it's very spontaneous and there's no plan, and that person is clearly having a fabulous time, but it's of no benefit to anybody else. And if somebody who isn't used to dancing does something really very highly choreographed, it's going to come across as very wooden, ticking all the boxes, just getting the right moves and not doing the right thing. But if somebody is to learn a certain amount of moves or possibilities within a particular dance, then maybe they can dance with someone else in a really nice communicative way. So you've got a plan, you've got a structure, and within those rules, you can be very free. So similarly to presentations, plan it. Don't read anything out. That nobody likes to listen to someone else reading. I'd rather have the document myself. But you do have a certain amount of freedom as long as the plan is very, very clear. And just remember that if you are editing, 1 hour per finished minute of video. So this is an argument, A, for making shorter videos, and B, for trying to get it right the first time. Don't assume that I can just cut that bit out, or I can just add that bit from later to earlier on. There's always a reason why they don't stitch together very well. So try and get it right in chunks. So take it in chunks, and it's easy and quick to stitch chunks together than it is to try and stitch little pieces together. So it's a bit crazy. Okay, so all of this, if you are going to do talking head videos, and if you'd like to do explanatory videos instead, so could I just get some answers in the chat box? Has anyone seen the pre-sessional materials? I'm going to leave my camera off because I don't trust my Wi-Fi, if that's okay. If anybody has a specific reason to turn it on. No, you haven't. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Nikki, one did. Great. It was in your confirmation email or in your reminder email yesterday, but don't worry, it will come out in the post session in the post-session email afterwards. So in that document, it has all of the technical explanations of how you do these things. So what we're looking at today is best practice of how you do that, but the step-by-step, do this, press that, you will find signposts to all of that in the pre-session material. So don't worry if you didn't have time or if you didn't see it, it will be coming to you afterwards. So make sure you go through this and have a look at the examples as well. So an explanatory video can be a talking head video with some annotations, either in diagrams or in words to clarify things, or it can be a screencast showing people how to do things, going through. Okay, you'll all hopefully get a follow-up email, and then that will sort everything out. So explaining something more complex than maybe introducing your course or introducing yourself, or introducing the field. So an explanatory video is a little bit more complex. Just because we're having Wi-Fi issues, can everybody please make sure their cameras are off? Thank you. So if you're doing explanatory videos, then you need a little bit more planning in advance. So with the talking heads, you need to plan, but you can be quite free with it. With the explanatory videos, you have to plan, and you need to be a little bit more assiduous with sticking to your plan. You obviously can change some things depending on what comes up on the screen that you weren't expecting, but then you need to fix that in your captions later on. So one of the things that is really helpful to do is to storyboard your videos. You may have heard the word storyboard used in other contexts as well, but for this in particular, it is essentially a plan of what you're going to say and what is going to be on screen while you say it. Okay, so if I'm doing a video explaining how to do videos, a video framing in particular, I will start with, as in the voiceover, leave a space blank next to you. And on screen, I don't need anything additional so that you can signal important ideas. And the important bit of that is signaling important ideas. So those words will appear on screen as I say, signal important ideas. So it's important that the words are the same as on screen as what you say, and that they appear at the same time as you say it. And then we go on so that you can signal important ideas or diagrammatically explain complex concepts. So you've got room to do those things on the screen in that space beside you, and you can put up a diagram instead. Make sure to take off the other bits before you do that. If you're going to do the signaling on screen, then you definitely need editing software that will allow you to do that. And they can take a little bit of time to learn, but if you're creating learning assets that your students will be able to use this year, next year, it's on content that isn't necessarily going to change every couple of months, then it's worth the investment of time and the investment of kind of brain space for learning how to use them. Okay, so video is one thing. It's very time consuming to do. It is, you need to be quiet, you've got to set it up, you need to plan, you need to edit it afterwards. There are a lot of different stages, and it's costly for time, but also for the number of tools that you need. All of those kinds of things mean that it's a great resource, and there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that video is a brilliant way to teach people, but it's not the only way, and it's certainly not the most effective way in some situations. So in deciding how we give our material to people, let's have a look at what we want the students to learn. So if we maintain very clear focus on what our learning outcome is for a particular piece of material or for a particular lecture that this material supports, be very clear on what it is you want them to do. So I want my students to be able to appreciate the complex context of our field and start to consider the bigger questions the course addresses. In the chat box, please, could you give me some suggestions of ways that I could provide material to enable my students to do these things? Pre-course reading material, yeah, marvelous. Intro reading, okay. A quiz, yeah. Okay, all of those are valid. What we could also provide would be a talking head. So if you are the leading expert in your field, which is very likely, you are the kind of personal representative of your field, certainly for your students, even if not internationally within the field as a whole. You can do a little talk about it, panorama episode if available. Brilliant. I'm going to come back to that with some diagram signaling. So in this, what I want my students to be able to do in that there's complex context. Okay, so you definitely want some sort of visual explanation that you also explain verbally to make sure that people are getting the information in two ways, and hopefully establish yourself as somebody who's worth asking questions of in this field. Considering the bigger questions that the course addresses, that's a fairly typical course opener function. So if you're doing a course online, what's really nice is to introduce the course, but not in week one you will study blah, in week two you will study X. That's fine, but much more interesting way of doing it is to pose a big question that the course can address, and that's something that future learn courses do really well. So that is a really nice thing to do with a talking head. So the video, a quiz, a document, we've got lots of different options: guided questions, panorama episode, lovely, and a reflective task. And I'm going to come back to this notion of reflective tasks in the active learning bit later on. So let's do something different. I want my students to be able to form a critical opinion of a piece of politicized sculpture. in the chat box, what could I provide to my students to teach them or enable them to do this? Historical context, okay. And how would you provide that, Dunstan? An outline plan, yes, nice. Structuring how their opinion would be done. Words, okay. Words on a screen, words in a document, or words spoken is the question I'm asking. A visual of the sculpture, very nice. References, photos, okay. Examples of critiques, images and pictures, fabulous. Okay, so we've got lots of options there. And what I've suggested is that we could provide a high resolution digital version of the sculpture. So if you think about the digital libraries, a lot of them have really high resolution digital images of a lot of artifacts. They might not have them for your particular artifact right now for this kind of panic term, but there is time between now and September to campaign for those things to be included. You could also include, let's say, 3 articles containing conflicting critiques of the aesthetics of the piece and the artist's motives. More than one sculpture of the same figure, very nice. Lots of great ideas there. So what I'm seeing is that you're looking at alternatives. So if we're looking at critical opinion, we don't just want to give them one sculpture and one opinion about it. We want to give them a selection of them. If they want to develop their critical thinking, you need to make sure that you give them the options to look at and evaluate different things for themselves. And in addition, we want to ask them a provocative question. So not just, what do you think of this? But ask something that delves a little deeper and makes them read the articles in a particular way, or analyze what they see in the digital version of the sculpture in a particular way. Yeah, Ewan, exactly. I found a statue. I found lots of photographs of him being pulled down, but it took up too much of my screen, so we got this one instead. So there are lots and lots of things all around that are really interesting to explore beyond giving them the kind of the basic, this the sculpture, this is the opinion, think about this. So you can be quite creative about it. The more creative you are, the more you need to plan this in. So I think for now, what we need to look at for this term is your baseline, and then how you want to improve that baseline for something really creative and interesting for when September, October rolls around. Another one, I want my students to be able to use a Genome Browser, which is a piece of software. Any ideas? In the chat box, please. A license, yeah, lovely. A screencast. A lab set of questions, yeah. A demonstration, share worked example, sample data, yeah, lovely. So sample data, or maybe a task to go and find a particular kind of data. So what I've suggested here is a screencast video, which is fairly standard these days. And in the pre-session, really post-session materials, you'll find signposts to instructions for creating screencasts and a number of tools that you can use to do that. You can also provide them with a task and clues. So along the lines of the worked example, but maybe pull out some things from the example that you can explain beforehand, maybe the beginning, and then leave them on their own to figure out the rest and see if they can find their way around and come up with the thing that you're looking for. So an example task, find the gene or genes associated with blue eyes in humans and diseases and traits linked to that phenotype. So we could do a small part task or larger tasks, and there's an interesting bit about whether you give them an explanation followed by a task, or you give them a task followed by an explanation. Both of those are very valid ways of going about it and have different cognitive processes attached. So one is practicing and one is figuring out. So think about what you want to do each time and plan such that you're not always doing the same thing, but that there is a reason for doing one thing one way and a reason for doing the next thing the other way, so that students get used to it. OD226, it's not necessary to use video to give instructions. Instructions can be given on slides. The thing with doing it on slides or in a Word document is you need to take a screenshot and instructions, then screenshot, then instructions, and it's quite laborious. But it's much easier to update if something in the software changes. So it is an alternative. And if you're not comfortable doing screencast video, which is kind of what people are expecting these days, but a document with screenshots and text instructions is also acceptable. Okay, and finally, I want my students to be able to use a specific type of formula to be able to calculate the economic cost of the pandemic. In your Gilly screencast video is explained in the pre-sessional materials, but it's basically when you record what you're doing on your screen so that you can show people. So, because a lot of messages keep coming up on my screen, apologies. So what are your ideas? So we could have a worked example of using this specific formula. Yeah. A task. Yes. Anything else? Yep. Screenshots versus screencasts. There's lots of people who have one preference or another. Get them to think about the variables involved. Definitely, this is something that I'd like to explore a little further, and ask the question about what is the cost and indicate possible formula. Lovely. Lots of data and more examples. Brilliant. So what we could do is a video of me, the instructor, writing out the formula, explaining the component parts as they appear, which you can do as a screencast, recording your screen, or you can do as lightboard filming, which we've also done as part of technology-enabled learning, but it's incredibly expensive to produce, so I wouldn't recommend it for this year. You could have a document or slide containing the formula and an explanation. And a task to calculate the cost, taking into account the various elements they're already familiar with. And as I said with the last task, you can either ask them to do some of it themselves first and then provide an explanation, or you explain and then they have a go. So Kalman, that's a nice idea to compare and contrast their solutions as well, because there are different ways of arriving at the same answer. So when we look at things like maths and hard sciences, a lot of people say that there is one correct answer. There always is one correct answer, but there are different ways of arriving at that answer, and it's always valuable to explore the cognitive process of getting to that answer as well. So we'll come back to this very shortly, but all of this to say that a video might be the right answer, it might be the wrong answer, depending on whether you're comfortable with it, whether it's appropriate for your students, and whether it's appropriate for the content type that you're trying to get across to your students as well. Okay, so I think Joanna said earlier on to using panorama videos. Basically, we don't want to create everything. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel was allegedly one of humanity's greatest inventions, or the greatest invention. But to be fair, I think we've come up with some good stuff since then as well. But it has had some improvements. But what we want to do is not focus on creating our own wheel or making a slightly different wheel that actually isn't any better. It might be slightly more bespoke, but it's not any better for our students in this context at this time for this learning outcome. So unless there's something really special that we can add by creating our own material, then curating is a much better plan. It's much better for your own mental health and the amount of time that you have to put all these things together. So don't reinvent the wheel. Focus on the axle. So I don't know if anybody saw, there's a documentary series on at the moment about our greatest inventions. And when they talk about the wheel, it's not so much the wheel that's important, but it's the axle, because the invention of the axle was what allowed the wheel to interact properly with the object that it was trying to transport, so that it could keep moving constantly and get the object to another place easily. So the axle was the really important part. So what I would like you to think about when you're curating and creating your resources is that we're looking at, okay, so here's this article, or here's this documentary, or this video, or whatever it is. Think about those things, but what do the students need to know around those? What are the instructions that they need to be able to understand it or process it? What kind of task do they need to do? What kind of reflection do they need to do? What kind of criticism? All of these things are really important, arguably more important than creating new individual resources. I'm going to come back to your question later on, Jamie. It's quite long, and we'll do it in Q&A later on. Okay, so don't spend lots of time reinventing the wheel. Focus on the axle and make sure that the axle moves the carriage that your students are in. Okay, so in all 4 of those modality questions, we saw 4 active learning tasks. It's a provocative question, task with clues, reflection prompts, and a puzzle with the calculation. So you had to figure out lots of different component parts before you could ever get to the answer. So what you need to be looking at is, again, focusing very strongly on your learning outcomes. Don't just ask questions to ask questions. Ask questions that take your students towards where they need to go. Set tasks that actively work towards developing the desired competency. Set quizzes. Quizzes are relatively easy to do within the platforms that you use, but they are not they're not your go-to necessarily. You still need to learn how to do a little bit, but I'm getting distracted by Dominic's question. Apologies. I will answer the question. Set the quizzes. You do need to learn how to use the tool, but they're very, very useful. And word your instructions carefully. The instructions are the thing that brings it all together. And if they're not there properly, then students will struggle and you're not going to see the response back that you're expecting. Use the data and the responses. So a question came up in the pre-session survey about how do you know that students are engaged? So we know that students are engaged in live sessions like this, hopefully because people are asking questions, they're answering my questions, responding to me. You're managing them very, very actively. But when they're online, you're not going to see them so much. But if you've built things in an LMS, you'll get data on how many people did your quiz, what scores they got, where their difficulties might lie, because let's say all of the class got number 7 wrong, so you might need to address that again. And equally, when you look at their responses to more considered questions, you'll see where the understandings lie and where they don't, and whether or not people have engaged properly with your material. Just to take it very low tech for a second, this is a course in Moodle on medieval manuscripts in the digital age, which is a course that we created this year. The formula is very, very simple. So we created some videos and some content, and we linked out to some other curated resources. And then the students had various tasks to do around all of those. So it is very low tech, and all of the questions are quizzes on screen. Quizzes are definitely suitable for adults, and I will come to why that is on the very next slide. So if you have a look at the introduction to the content, so on the right, that black box it's a video that will come along, but the instructions are really important. Watch the video to see an example of how we would describe Cambridge University Library MSDD 424. And there are questions. As you watch, consider and take notes on the following. You need to be really very clear about how you frame your questions. You need to sell every option that they're going to do, and just so that they know that they're engaging in something for a real purpose, not just for your entertainment. And equally, afterwards, consider and make notes on the following questions. These will be used to aid discussion in the class, and you need to take that into the class. So ask those questions again when you see them in contact time. Come back and do that again. So this time we're looking at reflective questions. We're looking at pre-watching, during watching, and post-watching questions that will then pull in to their wider discussion that is facilitated by you in real time, which will be very valuable. This is not done with OneNote. These are just screenshots from Moodle on PowerPoint. So higher tech and the quizzes, which I'll get to in a second, are very important, which you can do natively in your platform, or you can do with H5P, which is a very, very simple tool. It's free. And again, there's signposting in the document that haven't actually gotten to anybody yet. Okay, so thinking about quizzes, Thank you, Kalman. Thinking about quizzes, so multiple choice questions are the easiest thing to do in terms of creating automatic marking. So you don't need to go in and mark every single one, but you can see the data that comes back. If we think about, rather than asking quizzes as we would of children or for fun or for very basic reasons, we want to make sure that we stay away from the remembering bit of the triangle of Bloom's taxonomy at the bottom there. So if we take the example, and this would be a very simplified example, apologies to any actual economists in the room, we're going to calculate the economic cost of the pandemic, right? So if we take two variables only, and we look at, let's say, the loss of tax revenue due to business closures and additional government spending. There will be millions more, but for simplicity, let's just have a look at these. And if we imagine a ridiculously simple formula such as this, the cost is the loss of that tax revenue plus the additional spend. So those two things are by no means calculated yet. Okay, so the student needs to calculate the loss. How do they find that out? Where does it come from? What other pieces of data do they need in order to be able to calculate that? Same with the spend. It's not a number that is relative easily available. They need to go and calculate that, and to calculate it, they need to work out the things that are in there. So the question itself is quite complex. So how can we assess this with a multiple choice question? And if we're looking at this, we're not looking at assessing every line of working, every line of mathematical working. We're looking at how they think about analyzing the question or analyzing the elements of the cost, the economic cost of the pandemic. So if we create a multiple choice question and all we've said is calculate the economic cost of the pandemic at the end, and the answers are 50, 100 and 150, and I haven't put any measurements or currencies on those for a reason. So if we say that these are the three answers, it's never going to be exactly 50, 100 or 150, but it will be in the region of, or it will be in a particular range. And depending on how the person has done the calculation and how they have done the thinking about the calculation, they will come up with a particular range. So what's important about these, and this is an additional level of question design or item design, as Cambridge Assessment calls it, is to make sure that the feedback is in there as well. So let's say the answer is 50, and this is correct because you have calculated the loss of tax revenue and the additional government spending, and that is exactly what we wanted you to do. Or they come up with 100 and it's wrong because they have double calculated something, or because there is something specific that people normally get wrong, and this is your chance to fix it. And the same with the 150. You need to give a reason why the wrong answer was wrong and a reason for the right answer to be right. So all of that adds up to being a very challenging set of questions that you can ask asynchronously, that students can access on their own and work through on their own. It doesn't have to be a question of just, I've just said that this is the formula, rewrite the formula. That's just remembering or parroting, and we don't want to go there. We want to make sure, this is higher education. We need people to be challenged, thinking critically about what they're doing, and really analysing, evaluating, and ultimately creating new knowledge as they go through. Okay, so those are your options for how you get your materials across, how you communicate your ideas. And as I've said many times, in the document that you'll get in the follow-up email, there are kind of step-by-step type guides for you to follow. But a bigger question is what you move. So up to now, we've had in live sessions, we've got lectures. We're working on connection, being with people, especially now at this time of isolation. And in those live times, we also need to include content, but some content also needs to be self-access. So we're looking at some content live, some content self-access. What governs the decision to keep something in a live situation and or to put it out into self-access? What in the chat box would be your guiding light here? Most important points, possibly, yeah. Time differences, okay. Information in self-access and discussion or reflection and connection, yeah. Communal cohesion. Content to convey self-access, and then we discuss and analyze live. Yeah, nice. Learning outcomes. Thank you. Um, Permission of the information. Yeah, absolutely. And when you're doing talking heads yourself, the permission is already inherent in the fact that you turn the camera on. Norms for other lectures. Okay. Yeah. Those norms may change depending on how we go forward in the coming academic year and the time students might need. That's a really good point, and I'm going to come back to it in a second. So let's imagine that we have our original lecture, and it's got, for simplicity's sake, 3 concepts in it. Um, exactly, pre-recorded is essential. So what we want to do is focus very much and very strongly on our learning outcomes and figure out which of the concepts is the one that draws the others together. At which point are we in that? And all of the other reasons, for accessibility reasons, we want to give people more time, etc. All of those reasons are good, but this main decision is led mostly by learning outcomes. And if your course doesn't, if each individual lecture doesn't have learning outcomes, your course will. And if you've got them worded with active verbs as well, it makes this decision much, much easier also. So let's say we've got our 3 concepts. We're going to keep 1 and we're going to take 2 out into a time of preparation. So we've got 2 concepts going into preparation. They're going to need to be much more succinct so they don't take nearly as long as they do in the lecture, because there won't be any eliciting, there won't be discussion. It's just the concept, the bare bones, and some questions around it. So we've still got concept 3 in the lecture, and we're discussing, we're analyzing, we're evaluating, we're doing all those good things while connecting with each other around these ideas. But there's a problem with this. What is the problem? Can anybody tell me in the chat? I'm going to give you 5 seconds. Not tied together. People who don't do the prep, students won't do the work. Okay, not all students prepare. They may think concept 3 is not important. Interesting. Okay, or won't or can't do the prep. That's, yeah, all of those are definitely relevant. So the decision that you make is that concept 3 needs to be the ultimate concept of these things. So concepts 1 and 2 are preparatory almost to concept 3. So they are linked. And what you need to do, if it doesn't seem linked, is to make that very clear in the course information that goes out. So if you tell people in advance the preparation is important, I'm going to help contextualize concept 3, it will help you understand it better, and it will help you contribute and think more critically about what we talk about concept 3. So Elaine, that's an interesting point. So what we do in the lecture hopefully is draw those things together and unearth those misconceptions. So if you've created a quiz, you'll know where the misconceptions are, and you'll be able to address them as soon as your lecture begins, because you'll get that information back. The big question, so one is the preparation, and that about not everybody doing the preparation. But a lot of the cause of people not doing the preparation is not having the time to do the preparation. Time, as we very well know from our lives in COVID and beforehand, time is not infinite. And we've basically just asked people to do a load of extra stuff, and we've still got 1 hour contact time there for concept 3 and some discussion. So where is this time coming from? This is a tricky position to be in. So this might sound radical, but imagine now that you have 2 lectures. So we've got 6 concepts to get across to people, and you still need to be able to connect with them and not spend your whole lecture scrabbling to get to the end. So what we can do instead is bring these 4 concepts. So we have our final concept of each lecture. We're keeping those, and the review, because they're connected with the earlier concepts for each lecture. Move that one into lecture 2 and get rid of lecture 1. So essentially, we are creating time in the timetable for people to do preparation, moderated. It's still teaching because you've created or curated the materials. You're probably going to be checking quiz results. You're going to be doing a lot of things that support your students. It still counts as teaching, even if you're not in front of them for the entire time. And then in lecture 2, you do your final concepts for each one and work on working out any of the misconceptions for the other ones as well. So this might seem quite different to how things work at the moment, but we're looking at a new normal coming for in the next academic year. So it might be worth considering now how you might want to go forward. So very importantly, this picture here. Does anybody know where it is? Maciek, this is a really good point. You could keep the 2 lectures but make them shorter, but you're still going to end up with the same issue of not being able to necessarily get across enough content or make enough connection. It is another option, definitely, but just have a think about how you match them up and where the time for doing the self-access bit is. It is indeed Las Vegas. Thank you very much. It is not Paris, despite the Eiffel Tower being in there. But online learning, remote teaching is absolutely not Vegas. Okay, what happens online comes back to the classroom. So that's what I mean about checking the data from quizzes, checking the questions, discussing the questions that you set for them in the pre and post watching areas. All of that needs to come back, and it needs to be complementarity. It needs to be complementary to what they're doing. We don't know the student union position. We're not reducing the amount of content, just the amount of live contact time. So that is definitely a conversation that might need opening sometime soon. Okay, so thinking about complementarity, we have 7 minutes left, so we're coming up to the end. So we've got self-study and we've got webinars or live online lectures. When they're online, you need to have takeaways for learners, self-study, and takeaways for learners when they're live, absolutely. When they're doing stuff on their own, it's exploration of content, and when they're live together with you, it's extension, so looking at things more deeply and beyond what they've seen. Maybe in self-study, they're doing analyzing examples, and in the webinar, you're checking their interpretations. So you can do that via quizzes, you can do it via discussion when you're together. There are lots of different options. And then interaction and connection is obviously hugely important, and you need, because this is online, we need to pitch the next section. So we've done this and now we're going to work on it. Now that you get this, so it helps build the engagement beyond what used to be the one finite unit of a lecture. So you're looking at, okay, and now online you're going to work on, and you're going to do, and you're going to see. So thinking forward into the next self-study section. So your implications for planning is, what do you want to discuss in your live online lecture? Because the time that you have with them is still golden time. That's still the best time that they're going to have on your course, as long as you manage it sensibly. What do you want to discuss then? What will they get out of it? So clear focus on your learning outcomes. What do they need to have learned and considered before they arrive? And provide that, either create or curate it. And what active learning, and not just reading or watching, might they have done before they got here? And how does what they do in the live session extend and build on what went before? So these are the questions that you need to be asking yourself as you go through, if you decide to make materials available in advance to make room for connective activity when you're together. Okay, so I can see there are interesting questions that I have missed in the chat. If you have any additional questions, now is your chance. We have 5 minutes left, so I can take whatever questions you have. It's an interesting question about the student union and what their position would be. There is definitely a place for seminars, Dunstan, and interestingly enough, next week we are doing a session on seminars. So these last 2 sessions were on the lecture, the experience, and the content. So we've covered that now, and then we're going to move into doing smaller group discussions, breaking people into groups, etc. All of that kind of stuff. So let me go back. So time zones. Yeah, some classes live just isn't feasible if we want to include everyone. That's true. And that is then down to a specific arrangement that you want to make with your students. So maybe you want to run 2 sessions so that you cover 2 time zones. This session today is run at a time that is feasible for Europe and the States. So we've chosen a time on purpose to be able to do that. So it's kind of decision, kind of logistically down to yourself. Right, where was the longer question? Okay, minimizing effort. In a time of limited resources, it seems inappropriate to ask teachers to totally rethink teaching prepared pre-COVID. The difference between getting prepared teaching online and preparing remote learning. Are there different strategies for achieving these? Now is a slight panicky time that all of a sudden we've been asked to do this in a very different way, and that we're in a very difficult position because we haven't chosen this, we're not prepared, we're scrabbling to get things together all of a sudden and to provide for our students in a way that we should. But obviously, we only need to be good enough just now. But in the next term, the next academic year, expectations are going to be higher and tolerance is going to be lower. So right now we have a lot of goodwill from everybody, from our colleagues, from our students, and if it's not quite right, or if your Wi-Fi drops out in the middle of your session, everyone is going to be quite forgiving. But when we get to September, October, and if students aren't getting accessible materials in good enough time to be able to study, there is an amount of rethinking that needs to be done to be able to cope with whatever our new normal is. So even if we go back to completely face-to-face teaching, it's quite likely that you never know. There could be another peak to the disease, in which case we're all back in lockdown. Lockdown could be extended further. We could take a kind of baby step back to being together in physical spaces and have a reduced amount of physical proximity time. So we can do some sessions live in a lecture hall or in classrooms, but we still have to provide a lot of material online. So now it is a bit of a scary time. There are a lot of changes, and changes that we haven't necessarily volunteered for, but it's also an opportunity to prototype and play with different options while tolerance is high and expectations are relatively low, and see what works for us, see what works for our students, and then implement what we find is the best thing when it comes to the next academic year, when we find out what on earth we're going to be doing at that point. Let's see, there are more questions. Okay. Archived lecture capture work in this setup. It works fine. So it depends how much your material is changing and how um, I guess how dynamic the field is, and whether the actual content of what you're saying changes. What you might want to do is think about chunking your lecture capture content so that it's in smaller pieces, so that you can add activity before and after. So kind of prompting reflection or quizzes to check understanding, things like that. And if you're using Panopto, you can embed quizzes into your videos. So if you've got archived capture, then you can take that and every now and then you can pop in a question either that checks comprehension on what's gone before or that predicts what's coming up to maintain engagement. So there are lots of different options for using that. It is content but you just need to curate it now so that it's more proactive than reactive, if you know what I mean. Okay. Any other questions? It's 3 o'clock. Okay. Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much to everyone for joining, and thank you very much to Michael, Jack, Emily, Sean, and Jennifer, who've all been helping run the session today. And yes, if you'd like to sign up for next week's session on seminars and smaller group work, then please do. I'd love to see you there then too. Thank you very much, and goodbye.